Two men had spent the evening at a party hosted by a man named Nikolai. He had cooked for everyone. He had been generous with the food and the guests had eaten well. When the party ended, Nikolai had packed up the leftover meat and handed the bag to two of his guests to take home. The men took it and left. They walked back to one of their apartments, still talking, still laughing. One of them set the bag down on the table and opened it to put the meat in the refrigerator. He looked inside the bag. Then he looked up slowly and thought about the party, about the food, about how Nikolai had seemed so eager for everyone to eat. He picked up one of the pieces and looked at it closely under the kitchen light. Something was wrong with it. The shape was wrong. The texture was wrong. He had eaten this meat an hour ago and he had not noticed anything. But now, standing in a quiet kitchen with nothing to distract him, he noticed everything. He put the meat down and told his friend they needed to go to the militia. Right now. To understand how two men ended up in that kitchen on that night, you have to go back. Back to Soviet Kazakhstan in the 1970s. Back to a young man who, by every outward appearance, seemed completely ordinary. Nikolai Dzhumagaliyev was born in 1952 in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. He grew up in a country where the state controlled everything, where people did not ask too many questions, and where a quiet man could disappear into the noise of daily Soviet life without anyone looking too closely. Nikolai did exactly that. He was described by people who knew him as sociable. He drank with neighbors. He told jokes. He held down jobs. But there was something underneath all of that which the people around him could not see, a hunger that had nothing to do with food, at least not at first. As a young man, Nikolai had been in trouble with Soviet authorities before. He had a history of violent behavior and had spent time in a psychiatric facility. Doctors had examined him. They had noted that he was dangerous. But in the Soviet system, paperwork moved slowly, institutional memory was unreliable, and a man could fall through the cracks of a system that was too large and too bureaucratic to keep track of everyone. Nikolai fell through those cracks. By the late 1970s, he was living in Alma-Ata, which is now called Almaty, the largest city in Kazakhstan. He worked various jobs. He socialized. He blended in. And sometime around 1979, he began to kill. The first victims were women. Nikolai targeted women he met through casual social contact, women he encountered at gatherings or on the street. He would lure them somewhere isolated. He would kill them. And then he would do something that set him apart from almost every other killer in recorded Soviet history. He would consume parts of their bodies. He was not doing this in secret for long before the disappearances started to attract attention. Women were going missing in the area around Alma-Ata. In the Soviet Union, missing persons cases were not always handled with urgency, particularly when the missing were women with complicated social lives or no powerful family connections to push investigators. The cases sat in files. Investigators made notes, but no one connected the dots quickly enough. What investigators did not know yet was that Nikolai had developed a pattern. He used a knife. He was physically strong, and he had learned to dispose of evidence in a way that made his crimes extremely difficult to trace. Parts of his victims simply vanished because he ate them. By 1980, at least 7 women had been killed. The exact number would remain a matter of debate for years because the Soviet authorities were not forthcoming with information, and because not all of the remains were ever recovered. What investigators eventually established was that the killings had been happening for roughly a year before anyone began to look seriously at a single suspect. The investigation was being conducted by Soviet militia, which was what police were called in the USSR. They were working with very little. They had disappearances. They had some partial remains discovered in fields and near the edges of the city. They had no clear suspect and no clear motive that fit any pattern they had seen before. Then came the night that changed everything. Nikolai had been at a party. He had brought food. He had been generous with it, offering it to the other guests, and several people had eaten it without question. This was not unusual. In Soviet Kazakhstan in 1980, you did not refuse food at a gathering. You ate what was offered and you were grateful for it. Two of the men at that party left with Nikolai afterward. They went back to his apartment, and it was there, in that kitchen, that one of them looked into a bag and then looked toward the refrigerator and understood in a single terrible moment what he had eaten that night. The men ran. They went to the militia. They reported what they had seen. And when investigators arrived at Nikolai Dzhumagaliev's apartment, they found evidence that confirmed every fear the men had described. There were human remains in the refrigerator. There were parts of a body. There was blood. There was the unmistakable evidence of what Nikolai had been doing and how long he had been doing it. Nikolai himself was not there. He had fled. Investigators processed the scene carefully. What they found told a grim story. This was not a crime of sudden impulse. The apartment showed signs of organized, repeated activity. This was a place where terrible things had been done more than once, and where the evidence had been managed deliberately. Nikolai had been doing this for some time and had been careful, but the night of the party had broken his careful routine. He had let people come too close. A manhunt began. Soviet authorities in Kazakhstan searched for Nikolai across the region. He was now a named suspect, which meant that the full weight of the Soviet militia apparatus was looking for him. But Kazakhstan was vast, and Nikolai had time to move before the search fully organized. He was captured not long after. The militia tracked him down and arrested him without significant incident. He did not resist dramatically. He was brought in for questioning. What happened next revealed something important about how the Soviet state handled cases like this. The authorities did not publicize the arrest. There was no announcement in the state press. The Soviet Union did not acknowledge serial killers. The official position of the state was that serial murder was a product of capitalist society, a symptom of the decadence and moral collapse of the West. In the Soviet Union, such things were not supposed to happen. And so when they did happen, the state managed them quietly. Nikolai was examined by psychiatrists. They determined that he was mentally ill. He was diagnosed with a form of psychopathy and declared incompetent to stand trial under Soviet law. Instead of a criminal prosecution, he was committed to a special psychiatric hospital, which in the Soviet system meant a high-security facility where the most dangerous individuals were held. These facilities were known informally as special hospitals or psikhushkas, and they operated under the authority of the Interior Ministry rather than the health system. Conditions inside were severe. Nikolai entered the facility around 1981. He was classified as extremely dangerous. He was monitored, he was medicated, and the state quietly closed the file. For years, Nikolai Dzhumagaliev remained inside the facility. The Soviet Union continued to deny that serial murder existed within its borders. The families of the victims received no public acknowledgement of what had happened to their daughters and sisters. The case was sealed. The man who had committed the murders was locked away, and the world was not told why. But the Soviet Union did not last forever. By the late 1980s, the USSR was in a state of profound institutional collapse. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika were opening the system to scrutiny it had never faced before. State institutions were losing their grip. Oversight was fracturing. And inside the psychiatric facilities, the controls that had kept dangerous patients locked away began to weaken. In 1989, Nikolai Dzhumagaliev escaped. Exactly how he escaped remains a subject of some uncertainty. What is known is that he walked out of the facility and disappeared into a Soviet Union that was in too much chaos to immediately track him down. He made his way to Fergana, a city in Uzbekistan, which was at that moment experiencing serious ethnic violence between Uzbek and Meskhetian Turk communities. In the disorder of that conflict, one more fugitive was nearly impossible to find. Nikolai moved through Central Asia for months. He was a free man in a collapsing empire, and the investigative infrastructure that might have caught him was too consumed with the political crisis to focus resources on a single escaped psychiatric patient from Kazakhstan. He was eventually rearrested in 1991. He had been found in one of the former Soviet republics, living quietly, and was returned to custody as the Soviet Union itself was in its final months. He was placed back into the psychiatric system. After the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, Nikolai became the responsibility of the newly independent Republic of Kazakhstan. The new Kazakh authorities reviewed his case. He was examined again by psychiatrists, and in 1994, Kazakh doctors determined that he had recovered sufficiently from his mental illness to be released. He was released. Nikolai Dzhumagaliyev, a man who had killed at least 7 women and eaten parts of their bodies, walked out of a psychiatric facility in Kazakhstan in 1994 and was free. The reasoning given by Kazakh authorities was that he was no longer considered dangerous under the criteria used at the time. His file had been treated as a closed Soviet-era matter. The new state was building new institutions and inheriting a backlog of unresolved cases from the Soviet period. Nikolai's case fell through the cracks again. What happened after his release is difficult to verify in complete detail. Accounts suggest that he lived in various parts of the former Soviet space. There were reports over the years that journalists had located him, that he had given brief interviews, that he was living as an ordinary man in ordinary circumstances. There were also persistent rumors that he had killed again after his release, though no confirmed cases were publicly attributed to him in the post-Soviet period. By the 2000s, his whereabouts were unclear. The authorities in Kazakhstan were asked about him on multiple occasions by journalists and researchers. The answers were vague. He had been released. He was registered somewhere. Beyond that, the trail went cold. The victims he killed in 1979 and 1980 were never publicly named in official records that were accessible to outside researchers. The Soviet system had sealed their identities along with everything else about the case. The families who knew what had happened to their loved ones had no public memorial, no official acknowledgement, no formal record of the crimes against them. The state that had failed to stop Nikolai had also failed to remember the women he had killed. His distinctive appearance, which had given him his name in the Soviet criminal underground, came from a set of white metal false teeth. He had lost his natural teeth and replaced them with a prosthetic set made of metal. When he smiled, the metal was visible. That was where the name came from, Metal Fang, a nickname that sounded like something from a horror film but was simply a description of a man's dental work. That detail has stayed in every account of his case. The white metal teeth, the smiling face at the party, the food he offered to guests. Nikolai Dzhumagaliyev is believed to still be alive. He would be in his early 70s. Where exactly he is living, no one outside the Kazakh authorities seems to know for certain. Whether he is being monitored, whether there are any conditions on his freedom, whether anyone is watching him closely enough to know what he is doing today, none of that has been confirmed publicly. The women he killed are still not named in any public record most researchers can access. The full count of his victims is still not known with certainty. The case file from the Soviet period has never been fully declassified. Somewhere out there, an old man with metal teeth is living an ordinary life, and no one is entirely sure where.